The entire harbor warned him to stay away, and now he understands why. A broke veteran in a red and black flannel jacket spent his last savings to claim an abandoned ship frozen in winter ice, hoping the water would wash his past clean. But when his loyal German shepherd began barking beneath the steel deck, they uncovered a sealed compartment no one had opened in decades. And inside it lay a truth buried beneath rust and silence, a secret powerful enough to expose a harbor's darkest lie and change a forgotten man's life forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel across the water. Winter locked Duluth Harbor in ice, the wind off Lake Superior slicing through steel and memory alike. Walter Collins stood at the edge of the pier, boots crunching against frozen salt and gravel, staring at the ship no one else wanted. He was 68 tall, but slightly stooped from years of carrying weight that never showed on paper rucksacks. Wounded men guilt. His face was sharply lined cheekbones, prominent jaw square beneath a trimmed gray beard that never fully hid the scar running from his left ear down toward his collar. The scar had come from shrapnel outside Kandahar the moment that ended his military career and quietly reshaped the rest of his life. He wore the same thing he wore almost every winter day, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy enough to feel like armor faded at the elbows, smelling faintly of wood smoke and old oil. People at the harbor recognized the jacket before they recognized the man. It made him look stubborn, rooted, unmovable qualities. Walter had learned the hard way were sometimes the only things that kept a person standing. Beside him stood Rex, a German shepherd just past 9 years old, large even by his breed standards, with a broad chest. Dark sable coat dusted with gray around the muzzle and intelligent amber eyes that missed very little. Rex's ears no longer stood perfectly straight. One tipped slightly at the edge, a souvenir from his own working years as a military K-9. His movements were slower now, but deliberate, each step measured as if the world still contained invisible threats worth cataloging. Rex did not wag his tail. He did not bark. He simply stared at the ship with a focus that made Walter uneasy. The ship loomed ahead, half locked in ice, its hull streaked with rust like old blood that had tried and failed to wash away. The name along the bow was barely readable beneath peeling paint, Northwind. A freighter built in the late 1960s, decommissioned, reactivated, then abandoned again, its history, fragmented, official records thin where they should have been thick. Locals said it had bad luck stitched into its steel. Men who worked near it lowered their voices when it came up as if the ship could hear them. $5,000, the dock manager had said earlier that morning, not even pretending the number made sense. That's all the county wants. Liability transfer. Scrap value if you can move it. Which you won't. He had been a stocky man in his 40s, red-faced from cold, and years of drinking with watery eyes that slid away whenever Walter asked questions. He hadn't offered a handshake. Word traveled fast in a harbor town, especially in winter when there was little else to talk about. By the time Walter signed the papers, men were already watching from a distance. Dock workers, fishermen, a couple of retired sailors who treated the pier like a living room. Their expressions ranged from amusement to pity. Someone laughed softly. Someone else shook his head. Walter didn't look back. He'd learned long ago that curiosity fed on reaction. To them, he was just another broke veteran making a bad decision, chasing quiet the way some men chased women or drink. They didn't know he'd already tried silence in cheaper places, trailers that rattled in the wind, apartments where the walls were too thin to keep memories out. They didn't know how heavy it felt to wake every morning with no mission, no one depending on him to get it right. The ship, absurd as it looked, felt solid. It felt like something that had survived enough storms to understand him. Rex moved first, stepping onto the gangway without hesitation. His paws clicked against frozen metal nails, scraping body tense but controlled. Halfway across, he stopped, his head lowered, his ears angled forward. A low sound escaped his throat. Not a growl, not quite, but a warning shaped by experience. Walter felt it in his chest before he heard it. "You feel it too," Walter murmured, more statement than question. His voice was rough, unused to conversation. He followed Rex onto the deck, the metal cold even through his boots. The ship creaked beneath their combined weight, a deep, hollow sound, like something exhaling after a long sleep. The deck was empty, cluttered only with coils of frozen rope and a lifeboat that hadn't been touched in years. Snow had drifted into corners, hardened into ridges shaped by wind. Walter ran a gloved hand along the railing. The steel was solid beneath the rust. Neglected, yes. Dead, no. He knew the difference. He had seen worse things keep going. A voice called out from the pier. "You really bought it?" It belonged to a man named Hank Miller, a retired deckhand in his early 70s, short and wide with hands permanently stained from decades of diesel and fish oil. Hank had a thick white mustache and the habit of squinting at people as if the world were always slightly out of focus. He wasn't cruel, just blunt in the way men became when they had outlived their patience. Walter turned. "County says it's mine." Hank let out a humorless chuckle. "That ship's been trouble since Reagan was in office. Men went missing. Paperwork disappeared. Folks smarter than you walked away." Rex barked once, sharp controlled. Hank flinched, then frowned. "Dog doesn't like it either." "He likes it too much," Walter replied quietly. Hank studied him, then really looked. The jacket. The scar. The way Walter stood like someone who expected the ground to move. "You running from something?" Hank asked. Walter met his eyes. "No, I'm staying." Hank said nothing after that. He nodded once slow, like a man acknowledging a bad weather forecast, then turned and walked away. As the afternoon wore on, the harbor emptied. The sky darkened into that flat, metallic gray unique to lake winters where light seemed filtered through ice. Walter unlocked the wheelhouse door using a key that looked older than him. Inside, the air smelled of dust oil and something else stale but not rotten. He dropped his duffel bag by the wall. Rex paced the space, sniffing corners, pausing near the floor, then the walls, then the door that led down toward the lower decks. Walter sat heavily in the captain's chair. It protested with a squeal. He rested his hands on his knees and closed his eyes. For a moment, the hum of distant wind sounded too much like engines spooling up. His jaw tightened. He forced himself to breathe. In, out, counted like he'd been taught. Rex stopped pacing. He stood at the top of the stairwell, staring down into the ship's dark belly muscles, coiled tail low and still. The dog looked back at Walter, holding his gaze longer than usual, as if waiting for permission. Walter opened his eyes and followed Rex's line of sight. The lower decks lay silent, sealed behind shadow and steel, holding decades of things no one had bothered to catalog. He felt it then, not fear exactly, but recognition. The sense that this ship had not been abandoned. It had been avoided. "All right," Walter said softly, standing. "We'll take it slow." Rex didn't move. He kept watching the stairs, ears forward, breathing steady, as if listening to something buried deep beneath ice and metal. Walter stepped closer, resting a hand on the dog's broad back. Rex leaned into the touch, solid and warm, a quiet reassurance. Outside, the harbor lights flickered on one by one, reflecting off the frozen water like scattered stars. No one noticed the veteran and his dog standing alone on the deck of a forgotten ship. No one saw the way Rex refused to look away from the darkness below. And no one yet understood that the north wind had been waiting. The wind off Lake Superior did not sleep, and neither did Rex. Night after night, it howled along the frozen hull, turning cables into singing wires and ice into teeth, while the German shepherd paced the north wind with a patience sharpened by years of work, stopping each time at the sealed freight hold beneath the main deck, as if the ship itself were breathing there. Walter Collins learned the pattern quickly. Rex would circle the deck twice, sniff the rail where rust bled through paint, then plant himself at the stairwell leading down shoulders, squared ears forward, a low bark breaking loose only when the wind dropped into a sudden, unnatural quiet. It was not panic. It was insistence. Walter watched him from the wheelhouse doorway, the red and black flannel pulled tight around his chest, feeling the old tug in his bones that came when a mission found him instead of the other way around. He told himself dogs heard things men didn't, that steel settled, that ships talked in their sleep. But Rex's eyes, steady measuring, were not listening to the ship. They were listening past it. On the third night, Walter followed. He moved slow, counting steps, letting the cold bite keep him honest. The stairwell was narrower than memory suggested, paint blistered from decades of moisture. He ran a flashlight beam along the bulkhead and stopped when the light caught a seam that didn't belong, a rectangle hidden beneath a crust of corrosion where older steel met newer welds. This was not on the ship's plans. Walter knew because he had memorized the drawings. The county clerk begrudgingly handed over a thin packet with more gaps than answers. Rex barked once sharp, satisfied, then pressed his nose to the metal as if marking a truth. Walter scraped at the edge with a screwdriver. Rust fell away in flakes, revealing a recessed latch welded flush and painted over so many times it had become invisible to anyone not looking for it. The latch was cold enough to burn. He pulled. Nothing. He tried again, bracing his boot. The latch resisted, then surrendered with a sound like a held breath released. The hold beyond was smaller than expected, a narrow cavity tucked beneath the freight deck, insulated from casual inspection. The air smelled different, drier, touched with oil and paper instead of fish and damp steel. Walter eased inside the flashlight beam, cutting across a metal crate bolted to the deck. It was military issue, blackened corners, reinforced stenciling, sanded nearly clean. Rex squeezed past him without permission, tail low, posture controlled, then sat. He sat because sitting meant he had found what he was looking for. Walter knelt, fingers tracing the crate's edges, feeling the ridges where time had not been allowed to smooth anything. The lock was old, mechanical, not corroded so much as preserved. Someone had wanted this to last. He pried it open. Inside lay a notebook wrapped in waxed canvas, a manila envelope thick with folded pages, and a smaller steel cylinder sealed with a threaded cap. Walter took the envelope first. The paper was brittle, yellowed, but the ink had been protected, letters precise, disciplined in the way only soldiers wrote when they were trying not to betray themselves. The handwriting hit him before the words did. Caleb, he said aloud, without meaning to. The name felt like a bruise pressed too soon. Caleb Morin had been his logistics officer on a joint assignment years before the shrapnel, and the scar, a tall man with sharp angles to his face, a habit of trimming his beard too close, and a calm that never left him even when the radios went dead. Caleb had disappeared from the rolls during a reassignment Walter never questioned hard enough, because questions sometimes found answers that didn't come back. The letter was short. No greeting. No apology. If you are reading this, it began, then the ship has not moved, and the dog has not forgotten. Walter swallowed. Rex shifted nails, clicking once, then stillness. The letter went on to describe a transport run across Superior in the early 1980s, non-standard cargo sealed manifests, and a directive that changed twice in one night. It mentioned a reroute a storm and a decision made by three men whose names were redacted by time or intent. The final lines were underlined hard enough to leave grooves in the page. Do not let the north wind leave the harbor. Trust the dog. Walter set the letter down with care he usually reserved for wounds. He opened the notebook next. Inside were columns of numbers, shorthand maps of the lake with bearings marked dates, circled notes written sideways in margins to avoid detection at a glance. This was not a diary. This was work. Work meant to be resumed. The steel cylinder held a microfilm spool wrapped in oilskin, a technology older than convenience chosen because it endured neglect better than truth. Walter did not have the equipment to read it yet, but the weight of it settled behind his eyes all the same. Footsteps echoed above, measured, cautious. Rex's head snapped up. He did not bark. He looked at Walter, waiting. Walter closed the crate and slid it back into shadow, then stepped out, flashlight off, listening. A voice carried down the stairwell, female-controlled. Harbor security, it called. Anyone aboard? She introduced herself as Sarah Klein when Walter met her on the deck. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall and lean with pale skin, flushed red by cold, dark hair, pulled into a practical knot beneath a wool cap, eyes the color of wet slate that missed little. She wore a heavy parka with the city patch on the shoulder and moved like someone used to walking alone at night without apology. Her jaw tightened when she noticed Rex, then softened when the dog sat calm but alert. He's trained, she said, not asking. Sarah had been on night patrol since a winter break-in years back, had left a fisherman hypothermic on the ice. The incident had stripped her of any tolerance for rumors, replacing it with procedure and a private resolve to see things through. She asked questions politely and accepted short answers with a nod that said she knew when not to push. Walter told her he was checking wiring. He did not tell her what the ship had said. After she left, the wind returned louder, angrier, as if offended by the interruption. Rex resumed his vigil by the stairwell. Walter sat in the wheelhouse notebook open on his knee, tracing routes with a finger that shook only once before settling. He thought of Caleb's beard, trimmed too close, of the calm voice over bad radios, of the way orders sometimes bent when they crossed water. He thought of how Rex had found the latch without instruction, how the letter assumed the dog's memory would outlast human patience. Outside, ice cracked along the hull, sharp reports echoing like distant fire. Walter closed the notebook and rested his hand on Rex's back. The dog leaned in solid as ever. He did not sleep much. When dawn finally thinned the dark, the north wind looked unchanged from the pier, just another rusted hulk in winter light. But below deck, a truth had been named, and it was patient. Walter knew then that the ship was not a mistake he could sell away. It was a duty he had inherited, one that had waited through storms and silence for the right combination of stubborn man and watchful dog. He folded the letter once more and tucked it inside his jacket, feeling its weight against his ribs, as if it were a compass finally set. The storm arrived without ceremony, rolling off Lake Superior like a living wall, swallowing sound first, and then distance until the harbor lights blurred into pale ghosts, and the north wind groaned as if recognizing an old enemy returning. Snow drove sideways, sharp as ground glass, rattling against steel and skin alike, and Rex reacted before the first true gust struck, exploding into motion across the deck, with a bark that cut clean through the wind. It was not fear that drove him, but urgency, the same command-coded certainty Walter had seen years ago when seconds mattered more than plans. Walter followed instinctively, boots slipping once before finding purchase his flannel jacket, snapping in the gale as Rex skidded to the starboard rail and barked again, harder now, head thrust toward the pier where the storm thickened into a white roar. At first, Walter saw nothing but snow and moving darkness. Then a shape collapsed near the edge of the dock, a human outline folding in on itself, as if the storm had finally decided to take a life outright. Walter swore under his breath and ran the cold, burning his lungs, Rex already there positioning himself with precise intent. The woman lay half-curled against a bollard, her body turned away from the worst of the wind by the dog's broad frame, as Rex pressed close, anchoring himself between her and the lake. She was conscious, barely one gloved hand, clawing at ice breath, hitching in short, painful gasps. Her name, he would learn later, was Emily Hayes. Emily was in her early 40s, medium height, but slight in build, the kind of slender that came from long days hunched over archives rather than fragility. Her hair, a deep chestnut, threaded with premature silver, had come loose from its braid and plastered itself to her pale face skin, already flushed an unhealthy red from exposure. Her glasses were gone, likely ripped away by the wind, leaving her squinting through snow-blind eyes that still held an unmistakable sharpness beneath the shock. When she tried to move, pain cut through her, and she cried out the sound thin but stubborn, refusing to surrender to panic. "Don't move!" Walter shouted, dropping to one knee, his hands firm and practiced as he assessed the angle of her legs. One was twisted slightly beneath her, wrong enough to matter. "You're safe. I've got you." His voice carried authority shaped by too many nights like this, and Emily latched onto it, nodding once through clenched teeth. Rex did not move when Walter reached in, only shifted his stance, lowering his body further to block the wind, his coat already frosting over. Walter hauled Emily up in careful stages, ignoring the way his own fingers went numb, his back screaming in protest. Together they staggered toward the gangway, Rex flanking them, checking every few steps, pausing only to ensure they were still following. The north wind loomed out of the storm like a refuge older than kindness, its deck slick, but mercifully solid beneath their feet. Inside the wheelhouse, the air felt almost warm by comparison. Walter wrapped Emily in a spare blanket, thick and coarse, and set her down gently on the bench. Rex shook once, scattering snow, then immediately returned to her side, sitting close enough that his flank pressed into her leg, radiating heat. Emily noticed, despite herself. "Your dog," she managed, her voice rough. He knew." She reached out, fingers trembling, and Rex allowed the touch, eyes never leaving the door, as if the storm itself might follow them inside. Walter lit the heater and handed her a mug of water, watching the color slowly creep back into her face. When the worst of the shaking passed, Emily introduced herself properly, apologizing out of habit for being trouble. She explained she was a maritime historian, contracted by a university in Wisconsin, temporarily based in Duluth, to catalog old shipping records and oral histories that never quite made it into official archives. Her coat, now steaming faintly, was practical, but worn pockets heavy with folded notes, and a small recorder she checked instinctively, relief flickering when she found it intact. "I was cross-referencing peer logs," she said, embarrassment and frustration mixing in equal measure. "Didn't think the storm would turn that fast." Walter nodded. He knew that kind of mistake. Rex finally relaxed enough to lie down, head on his paws, but his ears remained alert, tracking every sound the ship made. As Emily warmed her gaze, drifted around the wheelhouse, landing on the notebook Walter had forgotten to close. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Those markings," she said, "they're not random." Walter stiffened, but did not interrupt. Emily shifted closer, curiosity overriding pain. Without her glasses, she leaned in, tracing the air above the page rather than touching it. "These symbols, see here and here, they match shorthand used in restricted cargo manifests from the late Cold War. Not common freight codes. People used them when they didn't want questions." Walter said nothing. The heater hummed. Outside, the storm battered the hull relentless. Emily continued, her voice gaining strength as the pieces aligned. She spoke of ships that vanished on paper without ever sinking, of routes erased, of captains reassigned, and records amended after the fact. She described patterns she had noticed, but never proven gaps that suggested intent rather than accident. When she finally looked up, her eyes met Walter's with something close to vindication. This ship, she said quietly, wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because it remembered. Rex lifted his head at that, as if approving the phrasing. Walter exhaled slowly, the weight of Caleb's letter pressing against his ribs. He told her just enough that he'd found something below deck, that the dog had led him to it, that the ship was not meant to leave harbor. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression sober, absorbing the implications with the calm of someone used to truths arriving late. Then someone wanted it forgotten, she said. And forgetting takes maintenance. The storm raged on for hours, trapping them together. By the time it began to weaken, the lake reduced to a low, furious hiss, and understanding had settled between them. Emily could not walk far on her injured leg, and Walter insisted she stay until the roads cleared. Rex remained close, his presence a steady anchor, occasionally nudging Emily's hand when her thoughts spiraled too far ahead. As dusk fell, the harbor lights flickered back into focus, and the north wind creaked softly, less like a warning now, and more like a watchful breath. Walter looked at the ship, at the woman seated across from him, at the dog who had found them both, and understood that the story buried here was no longer his alone. The ship had chosen its witnesses. Mark Reynolds arrived the way men like him always did, without urgency, without apology, and with the quiet assumption that the world would adjust around his schedule. He stepped onto the pier just after dusk, when the harbor lights were still warming up, and the ice along the waterline creaked like restless bones. Reynolds was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture rigid in a way that suggested old injuries never properly forgiven. His hair was silver at the temples, combed back with care, and his beard was trimmed so precisely it looked measured. The skin of his face was weathered, but clean, the kind of weathering earned from standing on decks and docks, not behind desks. He wore a long, dark wool coat that probably cost more than Walter had paid for the north wind, and leather gloves that had never known real cold. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, and transactional, always calculating distance between people, between outcomes. Walter Collins recognized him immediately. In harbor towns, powerful men carried reputations the way ships carried flags. Mark Reynolds owned logistics companies, shipping contracts, half the dry docks along the western shore, and a quiet influence that extended into city councils and courtrooms alike. People said he'd built his empire after the Cold War by buying what others abandoned, turning forgotten assets into profit. They also said he remembered everything. Reynolds smiled when Walter met him at the gangway, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Collins," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "I heard you bought yourself a problem." He glanced past Walter toward the ship, his gaze lingering a moment too long on the hull, as if greeting an old acquaintance. Rex stood at Walter's side, muscles tense, hackles just barely lifted. Reynolds noticed the dog and paused. "Impressive animal," he said, "military." "Retired," Walter replied, keeping his tone flat. Reynolds nodded. "I'll be brief. I'd like to buy the North Wind. Cash. Today." He named a number that hung in the air like a challenge, 6 figures, more than enough to erase Walter's debts, and then some. The county made a mistake selling it. Liability issues, environmental concerns. You understand. He smiled again. "This saves us both trouble." Walter didn't hesitate. Not for sale. The smile faded just slightly. Reynolds studied him more carefully now, noting the scar, the jacket, the way Walter didn't shift his weight or look away. "Everyone has a price," Reynolds said quietly. "Sometimes it's just not money." "Still not for sale," Walter said. For a moment, the wind off the lake was the only sound between them. Reynolds straightened, slipping his gloves back on. "Think about it," he said, already stepping away. "Ships like this don't stay forgotten by accident." He glanced once more at Rex, whose eyes never left him. "And dogs," Reynolds added, "can be persuaded." That night, the harbor fell unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Emily was asleep in the wheelhouse, her injured leg elevated a blanket tucked around her shoulders. Walter sat at the small table below deck, notebook, open microfilm sealed beside it, his thoughts moving faster than his pen. Rex lay near the stairwell, head up, ears twitching. The first sound was subtle, a metallic scrape that didn't belong to ice. Rex was on his feet instantly, a low growl rolling out of his chest. The intrusion came fast. A shadow slipped across the deck lights, then another. The hatch near the aft hold was forced with practiced efficiency. Walter moved without thinking, reaching for the flashlight, but a sharp hiss cut the air. Rex lunged, barking once, fierce and commanding, and then staggered. A dart struck his flank. The dog tried to stay upright, legs shaking, eyes locked on Walter as if apologizing. He collapsed with a heavy thud, breath shallow, but steady. Sedative. Professional. "No," Walter whispered, dropping to his knees beside Rex, fingers pressing into fur, feeling the slow, stubborn heartbeat beneath. Rex tried to rise again, teeth bared in defiance, but his body betrayed him. Footsteps echoed below deck. Two men appeared, both lean, dressed in dark weather gear, faces, partially covered, movements, efficient and silent. One held a crowbar, the other a compact radio. Walter stood, rage and restraint fighting for control. Behind them, Mark Reynolds stepped into the light coat, unbuttoned, expression calm. "I asked nicely," Reynolds said. "Now we're past that." Emily woke to the sound of voices and Rex's low, broken growl. She didn't scream. She reached for her phone instead, hands steady despite the fear tightening her chest. As Reynolds's men began searching the ship, tearing through storage lockers with methodical precision, Emily dragged herself toward the wheelhouse console. She knew the harbor's emergency frequency by heart. She tapped out a distress signal, short-clipped bursts, masked as static, and prayed someone was listening. Below deck, one of those men cursed softly. "Found something," he said. A section of the bulkhead near the sealed hold had been disturbed. A false panel loosened just enough to reveal a narrow passage leading deeper into the ship's skeleton. Reynolds's eyes lit with satisfaction. "There it is," he murmured. "The second compartment." They forced it open. Inside lay wooden crates, their markings faded but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Reynolds pried one open himself. The lid creaked back to reveal gold bars, dull with age but unmistakable, stamped with government seals long retired. Beneath them lay folders wrapped in oilcloth, shipping manifests, authorization letters, transfer orders bearing signatures that should never have shared the same page. Emily watched from above as Reynolds's confidence sharpened into triumph. She saw the truth settle into place like a final lock turning. This wasn't theft. It was retrieval. The North Wind hadn't carried contraband by accident. It had been used as a moving grave for evidence. Its roots altered its logs, erased its existence quietly, tolerated by people who benefited from forgetting. Walter moved when Reynolds turned his back. He shoved one intruder into a bulkhead, the impact ringing through steel. The second raised his radio, but Emily's signal finally broke through the silence outside. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. Reynolds swore, the first crack in his composure. "We're done," he snapped. "Grab what you can." They didn't get far. Rex stirred, growling through the sedative, dragging himself upright with a force that defied chemistry. His bark exploded through the hold, echoing like a gunshot. One of the men froze. Emily seized the moment, slamming the wheelhouse door shut and locking it, her voice steady as she broadcast their location again. Reynolds stared at Rex, at the dog's refusal to stay down, and something like fear crossed his face. "This ship," he said softly, backing away, "should have stayed underwater." He fled with his men just as harbor security lights flooded the pier. When it was over, Rex lay breathing hard but alive, Walter's hand never leaving him. Emily sat beside them, shaking now that the danger had passed. The north wind creaked, patient as ever, its secret no longer sealed. The truth had surfaced, and it was heavier than gold. Spring came to Duluth Harbor reluctantly, as if the lake itself needed time to accept that the long winter of silence had finally been broken. The ice loosened its grip in slow, cracking sighs, and the north wind, once dismissed as a rusted mistake, sat surrounded by caution tape floodlights and the quiet gravity of consequences. Mark Reynolds was taken away before dawn 3 days after the break-in, his composure finally stripped down to something small and bitter as federal agents led him past the very hull he had tried to bury again. He did not resist. Men like Reynolds rarely did once the math turned against them. His arrest rippled through the harbor like a shockwave under ice, exposing not just a crime, but a pattern: contracts quietly canceled, board seats vacated overnight, names removed from plaques that had once seemed permanent. The documents taken from the north wind traveled fast, sealed in evidence bags, escorted by people who didn't speak much, but asked questions that carried weight far beyond the city. Walter Collins watched none of it from the pier. He stayed aboard, sleeping in short stretches, his body still running on the old rhythm of threat and watchfulness. Rex recovered slowly from the sedative, his strength returning in careful increments. The dog was 11 now, his once fluid movements edged with stiffness, gray thickening around his muzzle. But his eyes remained steady, unclouded, fixed on the horizon, with the same alert patience that had carried them both through worse places. When Rex finally climbed back onto the forward deck, paused tentative against the warming steel, Walter felt something in his chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Some things endured because they chose to. Emily Hayes returned on crutches once the harbor reopened, her leg healing cleanly, but forcing her to slow in ways she disliked. She had traded her storm-soaked coat for a lighter jacket, and wore her hair loose now, chestnut waves catching the spring light. Her face still pale but sharper somehow, as if the truth she'd helped surface had given her posture a new alignment. She spoke less about history and more about people now, about what happened after the files closed and the footnotes ended. She helped Walter sort what remained aboard the Northwind, identifying what belonged to archives and what belonged to memory. When federal agents offered Walter compensation, relocation assistance, even a formal commendation, he declined them all with the same calm refusal he'd given Reynolds. "The ship stays," he said. "So do I." Sarah Klein returned too, no longer just harbor security, but part of the quiet machinery that followed scandals into their aftermath. She stood on the pier one afternoon, tall and spare in a plain jacket, dark hair pulled back tight, her pale skin already freckled from early sun. She had always moved with economy, but now there was less tension in her shoulders, as if the harbor itself had exhaled. "You could have sold," she said, watching Rex settle at Walter's feet. "No one would have blamed you." Walter shrugged. "I wasn't looking to leave." Sarah nodded once, understanding more than she said. Some places didn't let go of the people who listened. It was Emily who named it first, sitting at the small galley table with blueprints spread between mugs of strong coffee. A floating refuge, she said, tapping the deck plan with her pen. Not a museum, not a monument. A place that stays. Walter frowned, then considered it. He thought of nights when the walls of cheap apartments had pressed too close of men he'd known who couldn't sleep unless something solid was watching the door. The north wind had space. It had weight. It had learned to hold things without collapsing. The repairs began quietly. Walter replaced corroded railings, reinforced stairs, sealed leaks that had been ignored for decades. He worked methodically, the flannel jacket shrugging off paint and grease alike, Rex supervising from the shade when his joints allowed shifting position, whenever Walter climbed ladders as if tracking risk. Volunteers came at first, cautiously, then with purpose. A retired electrician named Frank, broad-backed and soft-spoken, whose hands shook until they touched wire. A former medic called Lena Compact and sharp-eyed hair cropped close, who organized supplies with the efficiency of someone who hated waste. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need explanations. They recognized the posture of a place built by people who knew what it meant to stand watch. By summer, the north wind no longer looked abandoned. The rust was still there. Walter refused to erase it entirely, but the deck was sound, the wheelhouse warm, the lower compartments cleared and repurposed. Bunks replaced crates. A small common room took shape where the secret hold had once been, sealed, its walls left bare on purpose. This was not a place for decoration. It was a place for staying. Rex aged into the role the way old soldiers did, slower but more deliberate. He no longer raced the length of the deck. Instead, he claimed the forward position each morning, settling where he could see both harbor and horizon, head resting on his paws, eyes following gulls and ships with equal interest. Children who visited with their parents learned quickly that Rex was not to be startled. He accepted hands' gently tolerated admiration with quiet dignity and rose only when Walter moved. Some called him Captain. Others called him Compass. Walter called him Rex. The first veteran arrived alone on a fog-soft morning duffel slung over one shoulder, eyes hollow with exhaustion. He stayed a week. Then another came and another. They found in the north wind what they couldn't articulate elsewhere, a steadiness that didn't demand performance, a silence that listened back. Walter didn't run programs. He fixed things. He taught people how to patch steel, how to keep generators alive, how to sit through a night without filling it with noise. Emily visited often, her research now focused on recovery rather than loss, her laughter, lighter, easier. She and Walter never named what grew between them. It didn't need naming. On the anniversary of the storm, Walter stood at the bow as the lake lay calm. Rex pressed warm against his leg. The harbor had returned to its rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. The north wind was no longer a rumor or a liability. It was a presence, a place that stayed when others drifted away. Walter understood then that the ship had never been meant to save him from poverty or obscurity. It had saved him from drifting, from becoming another man unmoored by endings. Rex lifted his head, ears catching a distant sound, then relaxed. The lake glittered. The compass needle settled. For the first time in years, Walter felt no need to go anywhere else. In the end, this story was never really about a ship or gold, or even the storms that tried to bury the truth. It was about the quiet miracles that happen when God places the right souls in the right moment. When a man who had lost his direction listened instead of running. When a loyal dog followed a calling deeper than instinct. When what was meant to be forgotten was brought back into the light not by force but by faith. Maybe God doesn't always part the seas anymore. Sometimes he steadies a compass. Sometimes he speaks through loyalty, through persistence, through a warning bark in the dark. And sometimes the miracle isn't that something valuable is found, but that a broken heart finally stops drifting and finds a place to stay. As you go back into your everyday life, your work, your worries, your quiet battles, remember this. You may feel lost, but you are not forgotten. God still works in ordinary moments, through small acts of courage, through listening when others walk away. The miracle might already be beside you, waiting to be trusted. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and light to every step you take. And may you never walk alone even in the storm.